second plenary session for the day. Our plenary speaker is a professor of philosophy in the School of Philosophy at Australian Catholic University and was its foundation head from 1999 to 2010. He was also acting foundation dean of the Faculty of Theology and Philosophy and acting associate dean in the Faculty of Theology and Philosophy at the Australian Catholic University in 2009. He is a member of the academic board of the university and served in the University Senate, the governing body of the university from 2004 to 2006. He is a permanent honorary fellow of the Institute of Philosophy and Sociology, University of Latvia, and was inaugural Crawford Miller Visiting Professor at St. Cross College, Oxford in 2007. He has been a visiting researcher at the University of Exeter and visiting professor at the University of Latvia. He is a fellow of the Higher Education Research and Development Society of Australasia and served as president of the Philosophy of Education Society of Australasia from 2006 to 2009. He is chair of the Human Research Ethics Committee at Australian Catholic University, a member of the International Association of Catholic Bioethicists, and an ACU delegate representing the Vice Chancellor to the International Council of Universities of St. Thomas Aquinas. He is editor of Ethics Education, a reference journal for applied philosophy and ethics in Christian tradition. He is an Australian Research Council consultant on the ranking of journals in the Excellence in Research for Australia initiative of the Commonwealth Government. He is also the regional coordinator for Oceania for the Council for Research and Values in Philosophy based in Catholic University of America in Washington. He is Secretary General of the World Union of Catholic Philosophical Societies. His teaching research and interests include metaphysics and epistemology, applied ethics and bioethics, the philosophy of education, the relationship between religion and science, and issues concerning the mind and personal identity. He has published over 100 articles, book chapters, reference journal articles in a variety of areas, ranging from applied ethics to metaphysics. His recent publications include Creating Public Values, Schools as Moral Habitats, special issue Global Ethics, Local Pedagogies of Educational Philosophy and Theory, published in 2010. Popper's Third World, Moral Habits, Moral Habitats and Their Maintenance in Educational Philosophy and Theory in 2010. He is currently working on the phenomenology of Wittgenstein and also on a number of aspects of the metaphysics of Thomas Aquinas. His most recent work deals with the philosophy of education in Aquinas and his understanding of teaching and learning. Ladies and gentlemen, our speaker will be presenting a paper on Thomism and East Asian philosophy. It's my honor and privilege to chair the session and to introduce to you our plenary speaker for this session, Professor Dr. John Ozolins.
Thank you for that very fine introduction. I'd also like to thank Professor Coe for his invitation here and to the University of St. Thomas for organising the conference and for looking after me so well. I did have a sad incident where my luggage didn't arrive, so I was a little bit anxious, but it's all good now. So thanks again for the invitation. The paper, I think, segues quite well with Professor Sweet's in some respects when I reflect on the beginnings of it, perhaps coming slightly from a different angle, but nevertheless the same kinds of issues, and the first part of the paper really is trying to grapple with this whole question of intercultural dialogue. With globalisation shrinking the world and enabling increased contact between different cultures, it's not surprising there's growing interest amongst Western philosophers in non-Western ways of thinking. Non-Western thinkers, on the other hand, are beginning to escape the hegemonic grip of Western ways of thought and reclaiming their intellectual tradition. In both cases, there is a renewed interest in what can be learned from different perspectives about ourselves as human beings and about the world around us. Internationally, there is a recognition of the global character of many of the problems that human beings face and the need for common understanding of their nature and for common strategies for their solution. Globalisation demands that human beings from different cultural backgrounds interact with one another and learn to work together to face the common problems that various interdependencies bring. While it's not entirely necessary for human beings to acknowledge any human kinship with other groups, tribes and communities in order to work for a common goal, an empathetic recognition of our common humanity will strengthen the resolve to work together. There's no doubt that natural disasters are the cause of great suffering around the world, but it is also true that they are also occasions when human beings come together to offer each other help and solace. In response to these, rescue teams are sent from all over the world and from different cultures, all with a common purpose: to do what they can to save human lives. Humanitarian aid is rushed to wherever it is needed in a matter of days and hours. It would seem on this basis that there is no doubt that what impels us to rescue others is our responsiveness to the plight of other human beings, in part because we recognise our common origin and kinship with them. A salient question to ask in the light of this is what commonalities are there among human beings and whether there is a common human nature which leads us to act according to similar moral principles. The idea of a common human nature has been dismissed by a number of philosophers, most often quoted as Richard Rorty, arguing that there are too many differences among human beings that make the idea of a common human nature implausible. This is, of course, a view which the Confucian tradition has generally been held to reject. In considering this question, this paper briefly compares two conceptions of human nature. The first, that of the Confucian sage Menji, and the second, that of Thomas Aquinas. And it will argue that despite their significant cultural differences, there are crucial similarities between these two conceptions. Both agree that there is a universal human nature, though they don't begin from the same starting point. There's no doubt about this in Aquinas, and it is argued that the balance of scholarly opinions that Menji also held there is a common human nature. The proposition that there is a common human nature provides the grounds for their respective arguments for the development of moral virtues that are necessary if human beings are to flourish and to reach their fulfilment. So, to the feasibility of comparing different traditions. Well, of course, it's a crucial question. What do we exactly mean by a common human nature? And I think these preliminary remarks are a way of trying and get some kind of conceptual framework against which our claims about Menji's and Aquinas' view on human nature can be set. A simple starting point is to say that by common human nature we mean that the behaviour, beliefs, values and ways of life of human beings are intelligible to other human beings who do not share the same culture or tradition. Secondly, we can suppose that across cultures and traditions human beings have the same desires and longings. Thirdly, despite the many different interpretations of what constitutes human fulfilment, the overall aim of human actions is some form of the common good. In relation to this final point about common human nature that human beings all share, it's suggested that though appearances may seem to support the contrary, and certainly against the prevailing Western tradition, there are good reasons to suppose there is only one common good. And it's clear that this perfectionist position in relation to the end of human beings is shared by both the Confucian Menjian tradition and the Thomist tradition. When we talk about intelligibility, we mean that an action which is described in a particular way in a tradition can be understood by another who stands in a different culture, not because there are concepts which map from one tradition to another, but because the action performed could also be performed in the other culture, though possibly for very different reasons. The action once explained in terms that an agent or actor in another tradition understands, the action is intelligible to him or her. The claim that human nature is the same whatever culture or tradition is encountered recognises the common origins of all human beings and so supports the endeavour to understand another culture or tradition. The intelligibility of an action does not depend on the translatability of one language into another, but rather the recognition that there are emotions, motivations, feelings and experiences which are the same whatever the culture or tradition. For example, it's possible to watch a film or a play in a foreign language that one does not know, but still have some idea of the plot. A Chinese man can fall in love with an English woman and vice versa, for instance, and not just in a film. And I mean here just to emphasise the notion of that falling in love. It's not an uncommon thing across culture. Practical experience of life points to human beings belonging to a common human family and hence to having a common human nature. This is not to suppose, however, in claiming that common human nature minimally involves intelligibility of human actions and cultures and traditions other than one's own, there is anything like full understanding of what is happening. However, based on various cues, it is possible to distinguish different emotions and even guess at relationships between people. It does not take a genius or years of studying human anthropology to recognise affection being displayed by one person to another and to be able to correctly guess the relationship between the couple. Although it's possible to be wrong, lovers are distinguishable from mothers and sons and from brothers and sisters. There is therefore plausibility in the notion that human actions are intelligible and also that there is a common human nature. In considering the question of how far we're able to understand another culture, not our own, McIntyre believes that it's possible for traditions to be bridged, though he cautions against expecting that the concepts being used in different traditions will mean the same and for one concept to be translatable from one tradition to another. Nevertheless, he acknowledges there can be broad agreements. A stronger view is held by Geoffrey Stout, who makes the point that the mere fact of encounter between cultures and traditions opens the possibility of innovative approaches to one understanding one another. The encounter itself is significant. On the other hand, this should not be taken to mean that different cultures can be understood from the standpoint of a particular culture. In order to understand another culture inevitably demands leaving the standpoint of one's own and trying to see things from a different perspective, a point that's already been made by Professor Swift. This leads us to conclude that in comparing Menchie and Aquinas on what they propose to be a common human nature, as far as possible each philosopher is best understood from the point of view of his own tradition. The temptation to interpret one in terms of the other is to be resisted as far as possible, since this will lead to misunderstanding and inevitably to a misleading view of one culture, of another culture, that may prove to be difficult to eradicate. Although Menchie and Aquinas are separated by a millennium, each represents an important tradition where the connection between religion and philosophy is unbroken. Aquinas is chosen because he represents the height of the medieval period of the Western intellectual tradition when Greek philosophy had been rediscovered, and because he most clearly represents a tradition in which philosophy and theology are brought together. Confucian thought also does not distinguish between philosophy and theology, and so the choice of Aquinas provides the opportunity for fruitful comparisons to be made. Moreover, since in much of Western philosophy since the Enlightenment, theology has been separated from philosophy, that is, faith has been removed from reason, there is a significant difference between Confucian thought and Western Enlightenment thought, despite some commentators arguing to the contrary. So let's move on to Mencius and Aquinas' differences and some similarities. Yearly remarks in his study comparing the accounts of Menchie and Aquinas on the virtue of courage that he had expected to find only contrasts between the two and was most surprised to find similarities. While contrasts can be expected, as we've indicated in the foregoing, they're not as surprising as Yearly considers them to be. as we have argued in relation to the possibility of understanding another culture. Nevertheless, his conclusion does have some support, since it's plain that when religious and theological perspectives are taken into account, there are significant differences. Despite our agreement with aspects of Yealy's analysis, there appear to be misunderstandings of key ideas in Aquinas. For example, Yealy argues that God creates the world but remains separate from. This is much too strong an assertion and arguably false, as Aquinas is well aware of God's immanence in the world as well as his transcendence. As creator, God is wholly other and transcends creation, but inasmuch as it is through God's power that the world's existence is sustained, God is also immanent in the world. Of course, Menji does not develop an account of Trinity, so clearly if Menji refers to the immanence of the divine in creation, he does not mean anything like what Aquinas might mean. I won't go into the development of that particular point, but it refers to the development of Aquinas' account of the Trinity. In Menji's organismic cosmology, all elements are intimately interconnected. They are what they are only by means of their relationships with other elements. A closer examination of Aquinas' account of the Trinity, however, indicates the importance of the relationship, of the relational in any understanding of the divine nature. The three persons of the Holy Trinity are bound together in their divinity through their relationality. Since God is immanent in the world, all created things are also interconnected, and arguably we can draw from Aquinas' theology that they are what they are by virtue of their interrelationships. The importance of relationality for both Aquinas and Menji is clear, but the arguments that each produces are quite different. Yealy also contends that in Aquinas the immutability of God, personal immortality and judgments after death are all fundamental notions. This is also too strong, since although these matters are important, Aquinas is not especially concerned with personal immortality nor judgment after death, though both feature in the Summa Theologica in his consideration of the ends of human beings. If these feature, it is because Aquinas sees the end of human beings as the beatific vision and emphasises our union with God as being our final perfection. Personal immortality and judgment after death are implications of this end, and so not fundamental in the sense of forming the basis of his account of the nature of human beings. In Menji, the aseity of God is not even a conceptual possibility. Personal immortality, much less judgment after death, is not a crucial problem. Even if you concede this, there is in both Aquinas and Menji agreement that human perfection lies in developing the virtues to the fullest extent, both aim at the good which is ordained by heaven. There are obviously significant differences in matters of religion, as one might expect. There is no notion of grace in Menji, revelation, church or sacrament. Furthermore, the methodology and the elaboration of concepts is very different in Menji. Analytic procedures and tools are important for Aquinas, but are not developed to the same extent by Menji. It is difficult to deny Yealy's initial assessment that the resemblances between Menji and Aquinas are superficial. They agree that a higher power is responsible for human nature and fulfilment, but a deeper analysis does not support holding any close agreement between them as to the nature of the higher power. Nevertheless, Yealy observes they seem to be both intent on bringing together very different positions themselves. Aquinas brings together Augustine and Aristotle, Menji, Yangchu, Mozu and Konji. An important point of contact between Menji and Aquinas is that they both subscribe to a holistic conception of the human person. Aquinas follows Aristotle rather than Plato to argue that the human person is not just a soul to which a body has been attached, but rather a single entity in which body and soul are inextricably united. The soul is the intellectual part of the human being. Thus, says Aquinas, we can speak of it being that part of Socrates which he understands, but Socrates also needs the body in order to have the phantasms, sense impressions, which enable his intellect to interpret the world. Hence we say that when Socrates understands something, we don't mean that it's the intellectual part of, or soul of Socrates that understands, but the whole Socrates. And Menchi sees the human being as an organic whole also, though in saying this he means that human beings are a union of appetites and what we might call their intellectual and moral part, which may be termed the heart-mind. The role of the heart-mind, Shin, is to direct or restrain the emotions and desires which, if left to their own devices, lead human beings to act according to the objects of the emotions and desires without any need to exercise human agency. Shin, though it is not the intellectual part of the human being, has a cognitive component which helps to regulate our actions. Menchi says it's wrong for a person to be only concerned with his stomach, but if he cares for it in the right way, then there's nothing wrong with that. Though these views are not equivalent, there is a similarity in that there is no separation of body and soul of the kind to which Plato, Descartes and others in the Western tradition subscribe to. Matteo Ricci, for example, was also convinced that there were significant similarities. In the Tian Shu Shi Yi, Ricci draws on a variety of Confucian sources, including Menchi, to show that Christian thought can be made intelligible through the deployment of Confucian terms. Ricci's aim in writing the Tian Shu Shi Yi was to write a text which could be used to teach the Chinese about Christianity in terms that they could understand. The way that Ricci approaches this task is to write in terms of a dialogue between a Chinese scholar and a Western scholar. What is of interest here is that in this philosophical dialogue which takes place about human nature and Ricci's assumption that the concepts he draws on in that dialogue are sufficiently intelligible to both parties for it to be meaningful to them both. The discussion about human nature in Ricci begins with the observation by the Chinese scholar that there's been considerable debate about whether human nature is good or evil. If it is good, taking the Menchian position that human nature is fundamentally good, then the cultivation of the Tao lies in following its dictates. We cannot go wrong. On the other hand, if it is not entirely good, then we will be led astray because, as a guide to the right path, it is unreliable. The Western scholar, in response, immediately begins to address the question of what is meant by human nature by turning to a discussion of what is meant by nature in terms of substance and essence. A definition of man soon follows. Having produced a definition of man, the Western scholar reflects on the uniqueness of human beings possessing reason and concludes, citing Menchi's consciousness of the differences between human beings and oxen, that human nature is essentially good. This is because the essence of human nature and human feelings are produced by the Lord of Heaven, and if we let reason control these, they are essentially good, not evil. Evil is produced if reason does not control human desires and passions. The Chinese scholar, in reflecting on this, asks, if human nature is good, where does the evil come from? The response from the Western scholar is almost textbook Aquinas, arguing that evil is not a substance, but a lack of goodness. For good measure, the free will defence is briefly introduced in an effort to explain why it is more meritorious to choose to do good voluntarily. If human nature was such that human beings could only ever choose the good, there would be no merit in this. It is only by consciously choosing to do good that human nature is perfected. Human nature, which is fundamentally good, needs the virtues in order to be fully developed and therefore for human beings to be fulfilled. The dialogue continues with a discussion of whether nature must always harbour the virtues, as otherwise it is difficult to see how it could be claimed that it is good. The Chinese scholar concludes that human nature must be innately good and that the virtuous person simply restores what has been lost. The Western scholar objects, saying restoring something to what it was before is hardly very meritorious, and proposes that there are two kinds of goodness: a kind of innate goodness bestowed by the Lord of Heaven, which all human beings possess, and an acquired goodness that is gained through the virtue that persons have gained through their lives. To illustrate this, Ritchie draws on the well-known example from Menchie of the child about to fall in the well. Feeling apprehensive about the fate of the child is something which everyone can feel and is the result of innate goodness, but the virtuous person will act rightly and do what can be done to rescue the child. Innate goodness is not enough for the right action to be done. Something more is needed, and that is the acquisition of the right kinds of habits of thought and patterns of activity that enable the growth of our good and that of others. In short, the virtues. Leaving aside a more detailed analysis of Menchie's example, what Ritchie's approach confirms is that engagement between two different cultures is possible. Moreover, this would not be possible if they were incommensurable and the concepts that they used were untranslatable. A salient observation about Ritchie's inclusion of the Menchian example to demonstrate the distinction between innate goodness and acquired goodness is that it is used by the Western scholar rather than the Chinese scholar. While it may be argued that his use of the example is crude and does not capture what is meant by innate goodness from the Menchian point of view, what is crucial is that Ritchie believes that his use of this example, drawn from Menchie, will communicate the distinction he wants to make between innate and acquired goodness. Not only do we have the use of an example from Menchie, but also an assumption that the example itself is appropriate for drawing out the distinction between innate and acquired goodness, and importantly, that the distinction is conceptually sufficiently the same in both cultures for the dialogue to be meaningful. Both Healy and Ritchie believe that the enterprise of engaging in dialogue with another culture, represented here by Menchie and Aquinas, is not only possible but leads to fruitful exchange. While we should not gloss the real difficulties and the strong possibility of misunderstanding and misinterpretation, neither should we deny that communication occurs. We have shown that even when particular concepts are considered, that even though they begin from very different starting points, their resemblances go deeper than might have been first imagined. Having established this, it's now time to look a little more closely at the conceptions of human nature in both Menchie and Aquinas. Menchie's views about human nature should be seen against a variety of competing conceptions of human nature against which he argues. One aspect of this position has been seen is the question of whether human nature is good or evil, and whether this is innate or whether it is acquired. In particular, the concept of nature, Xin, as used by the Maoists, needs to be understood if Menchie's conception of human nature, Ren Xin, is to be grasped, although Menchie doesn't use Ren Xin very much. But unfortunately, there appears to be very little consensus about scholars about the concept of Xin itself. In essence, the argument revolves around the questions of whether nature is fixed at birth, so that human destiny is predetermined, of whether it is differentially bestowed on human beings so that some are born sages and others not, the so-called inegalitarianism argument, and whether human nature is fundamentally good or evil. The Maoists held that human nature was not fixed and were among the first to expound the idea of human beings having control of their own destinies, that is, having the power to choose what to do. In their opinion, if they chose to act according to the will of heaven, then their desires would be fulfilled. On the other hand, if they chose to act against the will of heaven, their desires would not be fulfilled. This suggests that human beings, whether their nature is fundamentally evil or good, have the power to decide to be morally good, and so have the capacity to alter their nature. Thus, though some people might have been born with an evil nature, they would have the power to alter that nature and to become good. Acting against the will of heaven and remaining evil, however, despite acting according to one's nature, seems to be quite problematic, since in order to claim that nature is not fixed but alterable, an account needs to be given of why acting according to the will of heaven is good. If a person's nature is evil, then it would seem to follow that fulfilment of such a person would require acting in harmony with this nature. No Confucian or Maoist, however, can be interpreted as accepting this conclusion. On the question of whether human nature is evil or good, Menchie is unequivocal. Human nature is innately good. This does not mean that there's no need for human beings to engage in cultivating the virtue, On the contrary, human beings only have the virtues in embryonic form. They need to develop them. In claiming that human nature is innately good, Menchie proposes that all human beings are born with the same nature, arguing against the view that people are born with different moral capacities. That is, he denies that some people are born sages, some with average capacities for goodness and others born evil beasts. All human beings have the ability to achieve moral goodness. That they do not all achieve this is not due to different capacities for moral goodness, but to the choices people make and also to the circumstances under which their lives are lived. That human nature is fundamentally good does not relieve human beings of their responsibility to develop their individual capacities for virtue. The end of human beings is humaneness, says Menchie, which is to say virtue, or ren, in its widest sense. The term nature, or shin, can be understood in a number of different related terms. And in its broadest sense refers to the capacity or potential for something to develop in a particular way, given favourable conditions for it to develop fully. Ritchie puts the definition of nature very simply as the fundamental essence of each category of things, and by this he means that which can be placed in a particular category will have the same essence, and what cannot will have a different essence and so a different nature. In giving a very simple definition, one which allows a very wide interpretation of what can be included, Ritchie seems to be aware that an essentialist interpretation of shin would not be an accurate rendition of how Menchie uses the concept, since it does not capture everything which is understood by human nature. In speaking of shin, Menchie uses a variety of examples to illustrate what he means. For example, he speaks of plants, shoots and trees and their growth to show how an innate human nature must be cultivated if it is to develop fully, and for human beings to become the flourishing, virtuous human persons that heaven wills that they should become. He does not, however, espouse a narrowly biological view of human nature, since the moral dimension of human flourishing is social and not restricted to the individual development in the way in which plants might be said to grow and develop. In reflecting on the example of the child about to fall into the well, Menchie says that what the example shows is that all human beings are endowed with feelings of compassion, of shame and dislike, of modesty and complacency, and of approval and disapproval. It is these feelings or emotions which flow out of the basic virtues that all human beings possess and are judged to be good. Thus, compassion is the result of the virtue of benevolence, shame and dislike of the virtue of righteousness, modesty and complacency of propriety, li, and approval and disapproval of practical knowledge, ji. Since all human beings possess the four principal virtues as sprouts or seedlings, how we develop our emotions will depend on how well we have cultivated the virtues within us. Shin is what we start with. However, as we have already said, how it develops will depend on our circumstances and our choices. Shin also refers to the dynamic process of development and is therefore more than just the sprouts or seedlings of the four principal virtues. Aquinas also uses the metaphor of seeds in talking about the potential for human beings to develop virtues. He speaks of the natural aptness of virtue in the Summa Theologica, proposing that certain seeds or principles of acquired virtue pre-exist in us by nature. Aquinas also distinguishes two ways in which we can think of the nature of a thing: as the particular characteristics which enable us to identify a thing as belonging to a specific category, such as laughing could be considered a feature of human beings, and secondly, as characteristics which enable us to identify an individual human being, such as those that would enable us to recognise an individual as, say, Socrates. He notes also that human beings can also acquire, as part of their human nature, something from an extrinsic source. For example, human beings can regain their health through the assistance of a physician. Although Aquinas agrees with Menchie that human beings possess the virtues inchoately, He also believes that these will not be distributed to each person to the same extent, as some will be more inclined to fortitude, for example, and others to temperance. The same applies to the intellectual virtues. Some will have a greater aptitude for science, while another of the understanding of truths. This will account for the different ways in which human beings develop and perfect themselves. Menchie's use of the metaphor of the sprouts to talk about the capacity of human beings for natural development can be understood as a warning, since the sprout is more fragile than a seed. It will require more nurturing. Its fragility is such that we need to pay careful attention to how we take care of its development. Menchie says that if human beings fail to develop the sprouts, they play the thief with themselves, and if they should be prevented from developing them, they will not even have enough virtue with which to care for their parents. On the other hand, should they develop these to the full, they will be able to love and protect everyone. Menchie argues that it's possible to fail to recognise the real nature of something because it's been obscured by the conditions which have resulted in its failure to develop. Menchie uses the metaphor of a mountain which, once covered with trees, no longer is so because they've been cut down, and furthermore any new shoots are unable to grow because they are eaten by the animals grazing there. Consequently, no trees grow and the mountain appears barren. This is not due to the nature of the mountain, but rather because it has been prevented from fulfilling its nature. One could say that's an interesting environmental metaphor that we can relate to in the present day. This suggests that for Menchie things have their qing, that is, they have an essence which expresses what they genuinely are. Thus, qing, nature, and qing, essence, are different. Though the example of the mountain is suggestive and brings out the idea of conditions preventing the fulfilment of nature, it should not be taken to apply too closely to human beings. What might be meant by the fulfilment of the nature of a mountain will not capture what is meant by fulfilment of human beings, since human beings are living organisms that have emotions, feelings, and are able to think. A crucial attribute human beings possess is their ability to actively interact with their environment and to adapt to it in an almost unlimited manner. The same is self-evidently not true of mountains. The qing of a human being will be very different to that of a mountain. Menchie does not have a clearly articulated outline of the distinctions between nature and essence in the way in which Aquinas does, as he does not have a fully developed theory of act and potency. Nevertheless, qing refers to the characteristics of something as it genuinely is, and this can be understood to be the essence of a thing. Essence, however, can be thought of in two different ways. In one use of the term, it allows us to identify the whatness or quiddity of an individual thing, that is, it helps us to identify Socrates, and in another use, it enables us to determine that Socrates is a man. That is, we are able to pick out those characteristics which determine for us that a particular is identifiable with a class of entities. Of course, we can only discover the characteristics of something through what its actions reveal to us, as Aquinas, following Aristotle, was well aware. Essence can only be revealed through the experience of substance. That is, what we can know of something in the first instance will be through how we experience it. For Aquinas, what is distinctive about human beings and what distinguishes them from animals is their rationality. On the other hand, Menchie, while acknowledging the importance of cognition, argues that what is distinctive about human beings is the heart or heart-mind, qing, and the embryonic moral virtues within it. It is this that distinguishes human beings from animals. It's a question of how different they really are. Menchie warns that a human being's true heart could be lost and he becomes little more than an animal and be treated as such by others. It's not clear whether he means that a human being could actually become a beast or whether he thinks some modicum of humanity is retained. It could be said, though, that he regards this as unlikely, that is, that one completely lose one's humanity. Nevertheless, it's not entirely clear that he does accept this. Aquinas, on the other hand, while accepting the possibility that a human being could become vicious, does not allow that someone could lose his or her humanity. Aquinas has two arguments for this. Firstly, since human beings have a rational nature, the loss of this would mean that they did not have the ability to choose to engage in vice. And secondly, virtue remains, since it is part of human nature and so cannot be lost. But vice places obstacles in the path of its attainment. Applied to human beings, it's not surprising that in some people there will be capacities that will not be realised because the conditions were not right for their development. Thus, because someone behaves well while another behaves badly may be due to the different influences on their moral development. Further influences that have not been mentioned are the effects of choices made by an individual, that is, the effects of free will. Although Menji concentrates on the physical conditions which enable human flourishing, he is aware that it's not only these which will enable a person to be fulfilled. This is because physical conditions which are not conducive to flourishing can be overcome. A person may be able to rise above life circumstances which would usually prevent him or her from achieving his potential. This, however, seems to be a rarity. There are two aspects to this which lead us to suspect that Menji is alluding to the natural conditions which all human beings need as a minimum in order to have the opportunity to develop. Menji is right to say that the basic necessities of life are needed as preconditions for human flourishing, and it is these which he has in mind. Secondly, given the basic necessities of life, human beings also need opportunities for education and for employment, amongst other things. If these latter opportunities don't arise, persons may well fail to develop their potential, and this will be so for moral development as for any other kind of development. Menji is well aware that there are cultural, social and also personal motivations which will affect moral development. Aquinas is also aware of the importance of the right kind of physical conditions that need to be in place for human beings to develop the moral virtues. He observes in his discussion of the virtue of temperance that human beings need food, and that those things which ensure health and a sound condition of the body. Furthermore, he notes that moral knowledge is gained partly through sensory perception, which takes place through bodily organs, and so keeping the body in the best condition possible is basic to the pursuit of the virtues. He agrees also that once the basic necessities of life are taken care of, the development of moral virtue will require education and support of the community. So, to conclude, in this paper we've provided the briefest of sketches of the conceptions of human nature of two philosophers, one from the West, Thomas Aquinas, and one from the East, Menji. There's much more to be said about their views on human nature that's not been said here. We have touched on some of the difficulties in making a comparison of their views and argued that these are not insurmountable. What has been revealed are some significant similarities in understanding what is meant by common human nature and the final end of human beings. Both agree that a central feature of human nature is a call to live a life of moral virtue. Both agree that though moral principles are written in the human heart, human beings have to develop these if they are to be fulfilled. They differ, however, somehow in the central feature of human nature. For Aquinas, this is rationality, while for Menji, it's the heart, shin, which distinguishes human beings from animals.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Ozolins, for that brief but clear outline of the differences and similarities between Aquinas and Menji on human nature. Now, before we go to the open forum, just a reminder to the participants and to those who will ask questions. Please don't forget to state your name, the institution where you came from, and the country of origin. May we remind you that each person is allowed only one question. Rejoinders and replies are discouraged, and please go direct to your question. So, I see the hand of Professor Miller.
Thank you very much for the interesting presentation. I have a remark about some of the semantics or the vocabulary that you were using with respect to Menji's. In particular, some of language that is now quite common in North America in particular, probably also in Australia, but I don't know because I've never been there. Namely this expression of making choices, right? That people, however, rationalize their behavior by saying, I made the wrong choice and so forth. And this is, of course, very much related to a more philosophical term that we use, namely the term of free will. And I wonder if this semantics, which is, I guess, on the one hand, a very recent semantics, making choices, I think this phrase is probably only just a few decades old in this sort of usage. And the free will is obviously connected to enlightenment philosophy and so forth. If this is helpful with respect to Mencius, I think in the whole, again, semantic context of the Mencius, he talks more about things as certain practices, certain ways of life and so forth. But these are not really connected with at least he doesn't express himself, or the text doesn't have any sort of vocabulary like making choices or free will. But it's just how we behave, how we live. Of course, this has an effect on what we're born with and may change it and modify it. So my question is, why do you use this semantics, and do you think this is something that is implicit in Mencius, but that he didn't really express appropriately, or just I'd like to know why you're using this vocabulary.
Well, it probably reveals a little bit more about me than about Mencius. And part of that whole question of trying to understand another culture and to interpret what is being said. So, in making use of some of those semantics like choices and free will, it probably doesn't quite reflect Mencius himself. It's more a kind of my interpretation. So that's probably the simplest answer to why I was using that particular vocabulary rather than necessarily reflecting Mencius himself. So that was why I tried to explain in that very first section how difficult this is, and that it's very hard to get right into that. So I was aware of my own guilt in respect to this, but I think that point is well made. That he does talk more about practices and ways of life, and it's more my interpretation of reading, and it's a useful corrective. Thank you.
Okay, yes?
So you said that these exchanges can sometimes be fruitful, and I take it that they aren't always fruitful because one or the other of the parties has been persuaded of the other's view. So somehow these views might still have their differences as well as their similarities, and nevertheless the exchange and the communication will be fruitful. So I want to ask about one particular difference that became increasingly apparent to me. As you were listing the similarities, it seemed to me that a lot of those between Mencius and Aquinas would just as easily be similarities between Mencius and the Hellenistic philosophers. And it brought to my attention one of the very significant differences is in the conception of God, whether God is nature or whether God is a person. And I wonder whether you think that is a big difference, and whether you think that makes a difference for the sort of ethical perfectionism that you were talking about. Because that would be something interesting to see, whether these two ideas are closely related or whether they could actually be divorced from one another. And that would be one of the fruits of some such contrast and exchange. So I'm curious what you think about that.
Yes, it's true that exchanges may not always be fruitful, but one hopes that one continues a dialogue, and hopefully it will. I guess I take an optimistic point of view that while he's still talking, he might actually come to some kind of understanding of one another's position, even if you don't actually are persuaded in any kind of way. So I'm not suggesting that this is always a matter of persuading either way. In fact, it may just be a way of clarifying your own understanding your own positions, and it may reveal things in your own position you weren't aware of before. So it seems to me that's also one of the vital areas of discourse. Now, under the second part of that question about other philosophical views, and certainly people have compared Confucian thought to other areas. There's been people who claim that it's Kantian, other people are saying there's some utilitarianism going on there, and a whole variety of views. I mean, most of the consensus appears to be that it's kind of virtue ethics, but there are these other kinds of views about what Confucius is actually going on, or that Confucian tradition is actually saying about moral philosophy. The matter of God, that's a little bit more difficult. On the one hand, one could say there's no kind of conception of a personal God. The idea of heaven is not a personal God. At least that's what it seems, and there's certainly not a theological development in the way that Aquinas has. So I've tended not to take too much, read too much in any interpretation of what Mencius meant by heaven. There's certainly, one could argue that there is a sense of a mysterious supreme being of God in that kind of way, and certainly a God as a legislator, a God who gives us our destinies, our talents and what we become in life, or what we can become in life. So there is that idea there. The last point about common good, certainly both of those conceptions of God lead, or that there is a sense in which there is a supreme lawgiver. At least that much of it would allow for the idea that there is just one kind of common good, that heaven doesn't dispense varieties of human goods, that we have one nature and therefore we will have one common good. So I think that is reasonably, I think one can say that that's reasonably clear in both of them. So despite the fact that they don't have, or in Mencius you might not have this personal God, I don't think the common good part would depend on having such a personal God. That's perhaps my view.
One last question. Yes, sir?
Since we cannot deny the reality that there is a dominant culture and a not so dominant culture as revealed or found in the works of Levi-Strauss, how do we make the concept of human nature more dynamic in the context of a social responsibility? Thank you.
For the question. Well, look, I suppose my first answer is to ask about what you mean by a dominant culture. I mean, do you mean by that there is a kind of Western culture that is clearly dominant? If that's, I'm not entirely convinced of that. It's certainly, to some extent, there's a dominance, but whether it's overwhelmingly dominant is another question, and so I'm not quite sure what that then leads to. I don't know where that question takes us. The second part, how do we make human nature, an understanding of human nature more dynamic? I don't know that I have an answer for you. I suppose what emerges from some of this suggests that human beings need to take more responsibility for themselves, and we need to enable human beings to be more responsible. But of course, that there are also the physical conditions that need to be in place in order for human beings to be able to flourish. So perhaps if we're talking about fulfillment of human nature, then we need to look at what are the things that actually prevent human nature from flourishing, human beings from flourishing. And so both Mencius and Aquinas make that pretty plain. There are the physical conditions to start with. People need to be able to live. They need education. They need just food and shelter, and water, clean water. These are all issues in many parts of the world. So from that point of view, there are a number of things which block human development, and these are all kind of accounted for, I think, both in, or mentioned at least in both Mencius and in Aquinas. So I suppose my answer there would be to say we need to attend to those kinds of conditions if we are to achieve any kind of human flourishing. So I hope that answers your question.
Okay, so that concludes our plenary session for this morning. Thank you very much, Professor Ozolins.